It was one of those bright Saturday mornings that felt like a small reward after a long week. The air smelled of grass and warm sunlight. The sound of birds mixed with the faint hum of insects rising from the fields. For Daniel, this was peace. He had spent the last 6 months working 12-hour days, trying to finish several construction projects before summer ended. When the last nail was driven and the final check cleared, he promised himself a weekend with no noise, no deadlines, and no phone calls, just him, his ranch, and his boat. Daniel had bought the ranch 3 years earlier. It wasn't huge, but it had something he'd always dreamed of, a small private lake tucked behind a line of oak trees. The lake was quiet, peaceful, and half hidden from the road. He had plans to build a small dock one day, maybe a boathouse if time allowed. But work always got in the way. Now finally, he had the weekend free. He had recently finished restoring an old fishing boat he found through a friend. It wasn't fancy, just a small, sturdy boat with a new coat of paint and an engine that hummed like it was happy to be alive again. That morning, Daniel hooked it up to his truck, drove it across the pasture, and parked it near the lake's edge. He stood for a while, hands on his hips, admiring how it looked resting by the water. It felt right, like the land and boat belonged together. The lake sparkled under the morning sun and a few ducks floated lazily across the far side. Finally, he said quietly to himself, smiling. The ranch was Daniel's escape. He'd bought it to get away from the city, away from the endless meetings and crowded streets. But what he hadn't realized was how close the property line came to the edge of a nearby residential community. Just across the lake, a row of neat houses sat behind a white fence. They weren't intrusive, but they were close enough that Daniel could see their manicured lawns and mailbox numbers. Those homes belonged to a neighborhood run by an HOA, the kind that sent letters about fence colors and lawn heights. Daniel didn't have much to do with them. He lived on his own land, paid his taxes, and minded his business. But that morning, as he sat down on a folding chair by the water, sipping his coffee and looking at his boat, he had no idea that his quiet weekend was about to turn into something completely unexpected. Around 10 o'clock, a white SUV slowly rolled up along the gravel road that curved near the lake. It stopped not far from where Daniel had parked the boat. 2 people stepped out, a man and a woman, both dressed neatly like they were going to a meeting instead of a lake. Daniel watched them approach, their faces serious. "Morning," Daniel said, raising his hand in a friendly wave. The woman didn't wave back. She looked at the boat, then at him, and said, "Excuse me, sir, are you the owner of this property?" Daniel nodded. "Sure am. Can I help you with something?" The man frowned and gestured toward the lake. "You can't park a boat here. This is part of the Clearwater Shores community waterfront. It's against our HOA regulations." Daniel blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "I'm sorry, you're what?" "Our homeowners association," the woman said firmly. "This lake is maintained by the Clearwater Shores HOA, and boats are not allowed to be stored or docked along this side of the shore." Daniel stood up slowly. He wasn't angry, just puzzled. "Ma'am, I think there's some confusion. This here is my property. I own this land all the way to that fence over there." He pointed toward the row of oaks and the faint metal markers along the grass. "The lake touches my side, but that doesn't make it part of your community." The woman folded her arms. "Sir, this lake is shared. Our members pay yearly fees to maintain it. We can't have random boats ruining the view or leaking oil into the water." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Ma'am, I've been paying taxes on this lakefront for years. I'm not part of your HOA. I didn't sign any agreement with you. I'm just parking my boat on my land." The man took a step closer, lowering his voice as if giving a warning. "If you don't move that boat, we'll have to contact the authorities. HOA rules are binding within the community." Daniel looked from one to the other, trying not to laugh. "Then you go ahead and call whoever you need. I'll be right here when they show up." The woman sighed heavily, muttering something under her breath. She turned on her heel and walked back to the SUV. The man followed, shaking his head. Before getting in, he said, "You'll regret being difficult about this. We'll handle it." Daniel watched them drive away, still holding his coffee. He shook his head with a small grin. "Well, that's new," he said to himself. He didn't take the situation too seriously at first. He figured it was a misunderstanding, one of those things that would sort itself out once someone checked the county records. But part of him felt a bit irritated. How could someone from another neighborhood just assume they could tell him what to do on his land? He sat back down, trying to shake it off. The sun was high now and the water shimmered like glass. A gentle breeze rippled the surface and the ducks had drifted closer, curious. Daniel relaxed again, letting the calm settle back in. An hour passed. He had just started cleaning his fishing rods when he heard the crunch of tires again. Another vehicle, this time a black and white one, a police cruiser. Daniel sighed softly, stood up and waited as the car pulled to a stop near the same spot as before. Two officers stepped out. One of them, a middle-aged man with sunglasses, approached with an easy, polite expression. "Morning, sir. We got a call from the Clearwater Shores HOA about a possible property dispute." "You the owner here?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, sir, I sure am. I was just enjoying my morning when a couple of folks showed up claiming I can't park my boat here." The officer looked around, studying the area. "You got any paperwork showing this is your property?" "Got it right in the house. But if you look over there," Daniel pointed toward the survey stakes along the grass, "those markers show my boundary line. The lake runs through, but this side's all mine. The HOA doesn't own past that fence." The officer took a slow walk toward the stakes, checking the ground. After a few moments, he came back, nodding slightly. "Looks like you're right. We can confirm with county maps if we need to, but from what I see, they don't have jurisdiction here." The second officer, younger and quiet, glanced toward the neighborhood houses across the water. "Seems like they just assumed the lake was all theirs." Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, seems that way." A few minutes later, the white SUV returned. The same man and woman stepped out again, looking surprised to see the officers talking calmly with Daniel. The woman marched forward, her voice sharp. "Officer, this man is violating our HOA rules. We have regulations about boat storage and lake maintenance. He's damaging the view for our residents." The officer raised a hand gently. "Ma'am, this property doesn't fall under your HOA's authority. We checked the boundary lines. This land belongs to Mr. Miller." The woman's face tightened. "That can't be right. We've always maintained this shoreline. Our community uses this lake." The officer shook his head. "Using a lake and owning the land beside it are two different things. You might want to check your association's map. But as far as the law's concerned, he's within his rights." Daniel stayed calm, but inside he couldn't help feeling amused. The man looked like he wanted to argue, but realized there wasn't much he could do. The woman muttered, "We'll be contacting our legal team." The officer nodded politely. "You're free to do that, ma'am. But for now, there's no violation here." They stood there for a few seconds, tension thick in the air. Then the HOA pair turned around and walked back to their SUV, not saying another word. The officers thanked Daniel for his patience and left soon after. When everything finally quieted down, Daniel leaned against his truck and laughed softly to himself. He wasn't someone who liked confrontation, but there was something almost funny about how the whole thing unfolded. All he'd wanted was a quiet day by the lake, and somehow, it turned into a neighborhood standoff. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, Daniel pushed the boat a few feet closer to the water and sat down again. He watched the reflection of the trees ripple on the surface. 30 minutes of peace, he said with a grin. And now I've got the HOA sending cops to my ranch. He shook his head, still smiling. Somewhere deep down he already knew this wasn't the end of it. But he also knew something else. He wasn't the kind of man to be pushed around on his own land. And as the evening breeze swept across the lake, carrying the sound of frogs and crickets, Daniel's mind began to turn, not with anger, but with a quiet, clever kind of thought. If they wanted to play games about ownership and rules, maybe it was time he learned exactly how much of this lake was really his. That evening, Daniel sat on his porch with a mug of coffee in his hand and his dog lying at his feet. The sun had dropped behind the trees, painting the lake in shades of gold and orange. Everything was calm again, but his mind wasn't. He kept thinking about what had happened earlier. The way those HOA folks had marched onto his land like they owned it. The way they spoke with so much confidence, like they could decide what he could or couldn't do on his own property. He didn't like confrontation. He had spent most of his life avoiding unnecessary drama. But something about the way they treated him didn't sit right. It wasn't about pride or ego. It was about respect. He worked hard for what he had. He bought this land fair and square, and he wasn't about to let some neighborhood committee act like they had power over him. He thought about calling a lawyer, just to double-check everything. But before that, he wanted to know the full story of how the HOA got so bold in the first place. So the next morning, after feeding his animals, he drove down to the county records office. It was a small brick building near the courthouse, the kind of place that smelled like old paper and dust. A friendly clerk greeted him. "Morning, sir. What can I help you with?" Daniel explained the situation, keeping his tone polite. "I just need to take a look at the property maps around my lake. I own the ranch out on Millstone Road, right next to the Clearwater Shores community." The clerk nodded, typing something into her computer. After a few clicks, she pulled out a large map and spread it across the counter. "Here it is. You've got parcel number 148. The Clearwater Shores HOA controls these parcels here, numbers 152 through 159. But see this line?" She pointed to a thin blue marking that outlined the lake. "That's the natural boundary. The HOA only owns the sections that touch their land. Everything on this side, including the dock area, is yours." Daniel looked carefully at the map. It was clear as day. "So there's no shared ownership of the lake?" "No, sir. It's technically a private lake with multiple owners. Each one controls their own section up to the center line. It's common in rural developments like this. As long as you're on your side, you can fish, park your boat, or build a dock if you want." Daniel smiled a little. "That's all I needed to hear. Thank you, ma'am." He took a copy of the document, folded it neatly, and put it in his glove compartment. On the drive back, he felt lighter. It wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about standing on solid ground. When he pulled up to the ranch, he noticed something that made his smile fade. 2 bright orange notices were taped to the small gate near his driveway. They had the HOA's letterhead printed at the top. He tore one off and read it. "Notice of violation. Unauthorized storage of a vessel adjacent to community lake property." He laughed quietly to himself, shaking his head. "You've got to be kidding me." The letter went on to threaten fines and further action if the boat wasn't removed within 48 hours. Daniel folded the notice and tucked it into his pocket. He wasn't angry anymore, just amused. Later that afternoon, he decided to take a walk around the edge of the lake, just to see exactly how close his land came to the neighboring community. On the far side, behind the trees, there was a row of backyard fences from the houses across the water. He could see a few homeowners sitting on patios sipping drinks, watching the water. Most of them looked peaceful, unaware of any dispute. But when one of the HOA board members, the same woman from before, spotted him, she stood up quickly and walked toward her fence. "Sir," she called out, "I hope you've read the notice we left. The board has decided you need to move that boat by tomorrow evening." Daniel stayed calm. "Ma'am, I went to the county office this morning. Turns out you're mistaken. That part of the lake belongs to me." She frowned, crossing her arms. "That's impossible. We've always managed the entire lake." "Well," Daniel said, "you might want to double-check that with your paperwork, because as far as the county's concerned, this side is private property, mine. And if you'd like, I can bring the documents over." The woman hesitated for a moment, her expression tightening. "We'll review it with our legal counsel." Daniel nodded, still polite. "You do that. And please, don't put any more of those papers on my gate." When he turned and walked back toward his ranch, he could feel her eyes on him, but he didn't care. He was done being pushed around. That evening, as he sat back near the lake, he thought about how strange the whole thing was. He wasn't trying to start a fight. All he wanted was to enjoy a weekend on his own property. But something about the way the HOA acted bothered him, that sense of control they tried to have over everyone. Maybe they weren't bad people, but they'd gotten too used to telling others what to do. Over the next few days, word spread around the small town. People at the local diner started talking about how the HOA had called the cops on a ranch owner for parking a boat. Some thought it was funny. Others said it was typical behavior for that neighborhood. Daniel didn't go out of his way to talk about it, but somehow the story kept finding him. One morning, an older man named Carl stopped by his property. He owned a few acres of land just past the ridge. "Heard about your little run-in with Clearwater Shores?" Carl said with a chuckle. "You're not the first, you know." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really?" Carl nodded. "They've been trying to expand their management area for years. Keep saying the lake belongs to the whole community, even though it doesn't. I used to lease part of the water for my cattle, and they tried to tell me I couldn't. So what did you do? Daniel asked. I showed them my deed and told them to leave my cows alone. Carl grinned. They didn't bother me again after that. They both laughed. It felt good to know he wasn't the only one who dealt with their nonsense. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the events in his head. The arrogance, the notices, the way they called the cops without even checking the facts. And then an idea came to him. A small, simple thought at first. If they cared so much about controlling the lake, maybe he should make sure they couldn't. The next morning, he called the same clerk from the records office. Ma'am, I was wondering, he said, do you know who owns the rest of the waterfront properties around Clearwater Shores? I'm curious about the parcels next to mine. She looked it up. Let's see. A few of them are owned by private individuals, but several are still listed under the original developer, Millstone Land Holdings. They haven't been sold yet. Daniel smiled slowly. Do you happen to have a contact number for them? I sure do, she said, giving him the number. He thanked her and hung up. For a moment, he just sat there at his kitchen table, staring at the number. Then he dialed. A man answered after a few rings. Millstone Land Holdings. This is Brent. Daniel introduced himself and explained where his ranch was. I was wondering if the lots along the lake are still for sale. Brent replied. They're technically not listed right now, but we've been open to offers. You looking to buy one? Daniel leaned back in his chair. Maybe more than one. What are you asking for the entire stretch of waterfront next to Clearwater Shores? There was a pause on the line. That's about 5 parcels total. Let me run the numbers. They talked for about 15 minutes, going over boundaries and prices. The number Brent gave wasn't small, but it wasn't outrageous either, especially for someone like Daniel who'd done well in business and saved wisely. All right, Daniel said finally. Let's drop the paperwork. I'll come down this afternoon. When he hung up the phone, he couldn't stop smiling. It wasn't about revenge, it was about peace of mind. About knowing that no one could tell him what to do ever again. He spent the rest of the morning preparing the documents and went to meet Brent later that day. They sat in a small office overlooking the town square, signing papers and shaking hands. By the time Daniel walked out, he owned not just his piece of the lake, but the entire waterfront stretch that bordered the HOA's neighborhood. It took less than 30 minutes to finalize everything. On his drive home, the sky turned pink and orange again, the same kind of evening light that had started all of this just a few days earlier. But this time, he felt different. He felt calm, steady, and in control. When he reached his ranch, he walked down to the lake and stood by his boat. The water was still, the air quiet. Across the lake, the houses glowed with warm yellow lights. He could almost see the HOA members having their meetings, thinking they still owned the place. Daniel smiled softly. You wanted to tell me what to do, he said under his breath. Now you'll have to ask me for permission. He didn't feel triumphant or smug, just content. The whole thing had turned into something bigger than he expected. But somehow, it ended exactly how it should have. As the stars appeared in the sky, Daniel sat back in his chair again. Dog curled up beside him and looked out at the lake that now fully belonged to him. He thought about how strange life could be, how a simple weekend plan could lead to something like this. All he wanted was to park his boat and relax, but instead, he ended up owning the entire waterfront. And deep down, he knew one thing for sure. Sometimes peace doesn't come from avoiding conflict. Sometimes it comes from standing your ground, calmly, quietly, and with a little bit of patience. The next morning came with a quiet mist rolling over the lake. The air was cool and still. Daniel stepped outside holding a steaming cup of coffee, feeling a calm satisfaction that was hard to describe. Everything felt peaceful again. The kind of peace that comes after finally settling something that had been bothering you for days. He looked out over the lake. The water was smooth like glass, reflecting the soft morning light. His boat rested, where it had been all along, tied neatly to a small wooden post he'd set up. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing it in. The sound of his dog's paws on the porch steps brought him back to the present. "Morning, buddy," he said, scratching the dog's head. We own all this now. It still felt strange to say it. Just a few days ago, the HOA had been calling the cops and taping warnings on his gate. Now, after a single phone call and a few signatures, Daniel owned every inch of the waterfront that had caused all the fuss. He walked down toward the water, the grass still wet with dew. The thought crossed his mind that he should probably tell the HOA what had happened, or maybe not tell them at all. Part of him wanted to see how long it would take before they figured it out themselves. By late afternoon, he decided to check his mailbox. Sure enough, there was another envelope from the Clearwater Shores HOA. He could tell by the neat printed logo on the corner. He smiled as he opened it. The letter said they were continuing their investigation into his violation and that further penalties may apply. Daniel chuckled out loud. The timing was perfect. He went inside, grabbed a copy of his new ownership papers, and decided to pay them a friendly visit. It took only 10 minutes to drive around to the other side of the lake where the HOA office sat, a tidy building next to the clubhouse. The kind of place where everything smelled like air freshener and the walls had framed rules about community harmony. When he walked in, the same woman from before was behind the front desk typing on her computer. Her face stiffened the moment she saw him. Good afternoon, Daniel said, keeping his voice even. Got your letter. Thought I'd bring you something you might want to see. He placed the folded documents on the counter. She looked down at them but didn't touch them right away. What's this? She asked cautiously. Proof, Daniel said. I bought the rest of the lakefront yesterday. Every parcel from here to the old Cypress line. That means everything along this side of the water, including what you thought was yours, now belongs to me. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Daniel smiled kindly. So next time you hold a meeting about lake rules, you might want to leave this part out of it. He turned and started walking toward the door. Before leaving, he added, and don't worry, I won't be charging any of your residents for looking at my lake. As long as they stay respectful, we'll get along fine. He stepped outside before she could respond. The warm sun hit his face and he took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. By the time he got back to the ranch, he could already picture the conversation happening in that office. Phones ringing, papers shuffling, voices rising as they realized what he had done. He wasn't proud in a loud or arrogant way, just quietly satisfied. He'd handled the situation with calm, patience, and a bit of smart thinking. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Daniel sat by the lake again. He took a long sip of coffee and thought about how everything had changed so quickly. He didn't just own land now, he owned peace. No one could tell him what to do anymore. Still, he couldn't help but feel curious about what would happen next. The following morning, around 9 o'clock, a silver sedan pulled up near his gate. A man in a suit stepped out, holding a clipboard. Daniel walked over, wiping his hands on his jeans. Morning, he said casually. Good morning, the man replied. I'm with Clearwater Shores HOA. I was told there's been some confusion about property boundaries. Daniel smiled faintly. No confusion here. I've got all the paperwork ready if you'd like to see it. The man hesitated, then nodded. Daniel led him to the porch where he laid out the documents showing the deed transfers and parcel numbers. The man studied them for a while, then sighed. Well, he said finally, I suppose that clears things up. You really bought the whole stretch? Sure did, Daniel said. Every bit of it. The man rubbed his neck, clearly unsure how to respond. That's unusual. Maybe, Daniel said. But it saves a lot of arguments. The man gave a weak smile. I imagine it does. He packed up his clipboard and shook Daniel's hand before leaving. When the car drove off, Daniel couldn't help laughing softly. The whole thing had gone from ridiculous to almost unbelievable. Over the next week, the atmosphere around the lake changed. The HOA members stopped coming near his side entirely. No more notices, no more warnings, no more interruptions. Neighbors from the other side would sometimes wave from their yards. A few even stopped by to say they'd heard what happened and thought it was the funniest thing they'd seen all. Your one older couple came by one evening in their small paddle boat, drifting close enough to call across the water. You're the one who bought the whole thing, right? The man called out, smiling. That's me, Daniel said, smiling back. Well, the woman said, laughing, you gave the board quite a scare. They had an emergency meeting last week about it. I don't think they saw that coming. Daniel chuckled. Guess not. The couple waved and paddled away, still laughing. Word spread fast. By the end of the month, everyone around Clearwater Shores knew the story. The man who parked his boat got a visit from the cops and ended up buying the entire waterfront. Some people found it inspiring. Others probably found it embarrassing, especially those on the HOA board. But Daniel never bragged. He didn't post about it, didn't make a big deal. He just went on living his life the same way he always had. Quiet mornings, hard work, and peaceful evenings by the water. A few weeks later, he finally started working on his dock. He built it himself, plank by plank, with his dog keeping him company. It took a few days, but by the time it was done, it looked perfect, simple, sturdy, and strong, just the way he liked it. One afternoon while he was hammering the last nail, a young man from the neighborhood came by on a bike. He stopped near the fence and called out, "Hey, mister, that's a nice dock you got there." "Thanks," Daniel said, smiling. "You like to fish?" The boy nodded eagerly. "Yeah, but the HOA doesn't let us fish on their side." Daniel thought for a moment. "Tell you what," he said. "You can come by and fish here any time you want. Just make sure to close the gate behind you." The boy's face lit up. "Really?" "Really," Daniel said. "Bring your dad if he wants. The fish don't care about HOA rules." From then on, the boy came by often. Sometimes with his dad, sometimes alone, always polite, always grateful. Daniel liked that. It reminded him of when he was a kid, when the world felt simpler. As summer went on, the lake became a place of calm again. No more tension, no more drama, just water, trees, and peace. One afternoon, Daniel was sitting on the porch when a letter arrived. He recognized the HOA logo again, but this time it looked different. Inside was a simple message. "Dear Mr. Miller, the Clearwater Shores Homeowners Association acknowledges your ownership of the lakefront property and appreciates your cooperation regarding community access and maintenance. We hope to maintain a respectful relationship moving forward. Sincerely, the board." Daniel smiled as he read it. It was as close to an apology as they'd ever give. He didn't need more than that. He folded the letter, set it on the table, and went back outside. The sun was dipping low again, painting the sky with colors that mirrored the calm inside him. He thought about how strange it all was and how something that started with frustration and conflict ended up teaching him so much about patience and resolve. He hadn't yelled, hadn't fought, hadn't tried to humiliate anyone. He just stood his ground and found a smart way to handle it. That evening, as the first stars appeared and the water rippled softly under the breeze, Daniel whispered, "Sometimes the best way to win is to stay quiet and let time do the talking." His dog wagged its tail as if agreeing. The night settled in softly, and the lights from the houses across the lake twinkled like reflections of peace, the kind that comes only when you've earned it. Days passed peacefully. After that last letter from the HOA, Daniel didn't think about them much anymore. The whole situation felt like a strange memory, something that had come and gone, leaving behind quiet laughter and a good story to tell someday. The weather started to warm up as spring turned to early summer. The lake shimmered every morning and the grass grew thicker along the banks. Daniel spent his days fixing fences, trimming trees, and tending to small projects around the ranch. But most afternoons he'd find himself back by the lake, sitting on his wooden chair with a cool drink, watching the sunlight dance on the water. He loved those quiet hours. No phone calls, no noise, no problems, just the sound of nature. Sometimes a breeze would roll across the water, and he'd close his eyes and listen. He'd worked hard most of his life, long days, long nights, and now he could finally enjoy what he'd built. But life has a funny way of bringing surprises, even when things seem calm. One morning as Daniel was walking back from the barn, he saw a familiar car parked near his gate. It was the same silver sedan the HOA representative had driven before. The man stepped out again, but this time his face carried no tension. He smiled and waved politely. "Good morning," the man said. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Daniel said. "What brings you back?" The man adjusted his tie and held out a small folder. "I just wanted to follow up on behalf of the Clearwater Shores Board. They wanted me to deliver a formal agreement proposal." Daniel raised an eyebrow but kept a friendly tone. "An agreement about what?" The man opened the folder and handed him a few sheets of paper. "It's not anything legal, really. Just a mutual understanding." The board was hoping you'd allow limited access to a small section of the lake, mostly for residents to walk along or enjoy the view. In return, they'd contribute to the upkeep and help maintain the area. Daniel took the papers and skimmed through them. The language was polite, filled with words like mutual cooperation and community partnership. It didn't sound bad at all. But he could tell the HOA was trying to find a way to save face. He looked up with a calm smile. "I appreciate the offer, but I think we'll keep things simple. The lake's been just fine as it is. I don't mind neighbors enjoying the view from their side, but access to this side will stay private. Less paperwork, less confusion." The man nodded, clearly expecting that answer. "Understood, sir. I'll let them know." As he turned to leave, Daniel added, "Tell them I'm not trying to be difficult. I just want peace. That's all I ever wanted." The man gave a small smile. "I can tell. Have a good day, Mr. Miller." After he left, Daniel stood there for a while, looking out across the lake. He didn't feel any bitterness toward them. In fact, he almost felt sorry for them. They had spent so much time trying to control everything that they'd forgotten how to simply enjoy what they already had. That weekend, a few families from the neighborhood came out to their backyards by the lake. Daniel could hear children laughing and the sound of someone playing soft music from a speaker. The air was warm and everything felt peaceful again. The kind of peace that comes when everyone finally understands where they stand. Later that evening, as Daniel sat on the dock with his dog beside him, he noticed something unexpected. Across the lake, one of the HOA members, an older man with gray hair, walked down to the fence line and gave a small wave. Daniel waved back. The man called out, "Hey there, just wanted to say the lake's looking great. Thanks for keeping it up." Daniel smiled. "Appreciate that. It's been a good season," the man nodded. "It sure has. Maybe one day we can have a barbecue or something. All of us together. No HOA talk, just neighbors enjoying the view." Daniel laughed. "You know, that sounds like a fine idea." The man smiled, then turned and walked back toward his house. Daniel sat there for a while longer, watching the reflection of the moon start to form on the water. The idea of a community barbecue didn't sound half bad. Maybe things were finally turning around. Over the next few weeks, Daniel noticed more friendly waves from across the lake. People seemed lighter, more at ease. The arguments had faded, and what replaced them was something simple: respect. One Saturday, a family from the other side asked if they could come over to see the new dock. They brought homemade pie as a gesture of thanks. Daniel welcomed them warmly. They talked for hours about the lake, the weather, fishing, and even life before all the property drama. It turned out they weren't bad people at all. They had just been following what their HOA told them to do, not realizing how far things had gone. When they left, Daniel stood by the water again, thinking about how quickly things could change once people simply chose kindness over control. That night, he decided to take his boat out for a short ride. The air was still, the stars bright. As the engine purred softly and the boat glided across the calm surface, Daniel felt a deep sense of contentment. The reflection of the moon shimmered like silver on the water. He cut the engine and let the boat drift. The sounds of crickets and frogs filled the air. For a long while, he just sat there looking at the sky, thinking about everything that had happened. From a quiet morning that turned into an argument, to a police visit, to a property purchase that changed everything. It all felt surreal now. But somehow it had all led to this moment of peace. When he returned to shore, he pulled the boat up gently and tied it to the dock. He sat for a while longer, watching small ripples fade into stillness. The next morning, Daniel decided to do something unexpected. He wrote a short letter to the Clearwater Shores HOA, not a complaint or a warning. Just a simple note. It said, "Dear neighbors, owning this side of the lake has been a privilege, but it's also a responsibility. I want to keep it beautiful and peaceful for everyone who enjoys looking at it. Feel free to organize a cleanup day sometime. I'll provide the tools and refreshments. No rules, no paperwork, just good neighbors helping out. Sincerely, Daniel Miller." He dropped it off at their office mailbox and went about his day. A week later, he saw a small group of people from across the lake picking up trash along the shoreline on their side. They waved when they saw him, and he waved back. Someone shouted, "We got your note." "Great idea!" He smiled and gave them a thumbs up. It was a simple thing, but it meant something. After all the tension, The lake had finally become what it should have been from the start, a shared piece of peace. Later that evening, as he grilled some food on his porch, he thought about how everything could have gone differently if he'd lost his temper or fought back in anger. Instead, patience had paid off. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's calm. It's living well. The sound of laughter carried across the water again that night. Some of the HOA families were sitting outside having a small gathering. Daniel could see lights strung across a few backyards. He smiled quietly, knowing there was no more hostility, no more dividing lines, just people enjoying the same view from different sides. As he leaned back in his chair, he realized how much the lake had changed over the months, not just in ownership but in spirit. It wasn't just about land or property anymore. It had become something bigger, a lesson in patience, respect, and quiet strength. The moon rose high again, casting a silver glow over the water. The air was cool and still. Daniel took a slow sip of his drink and whispered softly to himself, "This is what peace looks like." His dog lifted its head, wagging its tail, then lay back down beside him. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt like everything had found its place. The land, the lake, the people, even the silence between them. The next few months drifted by like slow-moving clouds over the lake. The water was clear, calm, and full of life again. Daniel had found a rhythm that made his days feel whole. He'd wake up early, feed the animals, check the fences, and spend his evenings by the water, sometimes fishing, sometimes just sitting quietly. The ranch had become everything he ever dreamed of, peaceful, open, and full of simple joys. The lake looked different now, though. It wasn't just a piece of property anymore. It was a story, a reminder of patience and how people can change if given the chance. The once tense boundary between his land and the HOA community had faded into something softer. Now and then, families from across the water would wave, and sometimes they'd even shout greetings or short jokes. The tension that once filled the air had vanished completely. One sunny morning, Daniel was working near the barn when he heard tires on gravel. He turned and saw a couple of cars pulling up near the old wooden gate. He recognized one of them, the older man from the HOA who had once called the police that day so long ago. But this time the man wasn't frowning. He was smiling, and he wasn't alone. Behind him, a few more people from the community were stepping out of their cars, carrying coolers, folding chairs, and a barbecue grill. Daniel walked over, brushing off his hands. "Well, this is a surprise," he said with a grin. The older man smiled back. "Hope you don't mind us stopping by. A few of us thought it might be nice to have that barbecue we talked about months ago. You did say it sounded like a fine idea." Daniel chuckled. "I did say that. You folks sure took your time," the man laughed. "We wanted to make sure we came with good food and good manners this time." They all shared a laugh, and just like that the ice was gone. Not that any was left anyway. Daniel waved them in. "Come on in then. The lake's big enough for everyone." By noon, the air was full of the smell of grilled food and the sound of laughter. The sun shimmered across the water, and children skipped stones along the edge. Daniel brought out a few extra chairs from his shed, and someone set up a small speaker playing soft music. It was strange to think about how far things had come. From the day the police showed up to now, a group of neighbors sharing a meal on his land. But that was life. It had a way of turning full circle when people chose to meet each other halfway. As they ate, one of the younger residents, a tall man with a friendly smile, turned to Daniel and said, "You know, we didn't realize back then how much this lake meant to you. We just saw it as another property issue. But being here now, I get it. It's peaceful. You can't really understand it until you stand here yourself." Daniel nodded slowly. "I think that's true about a lot of things in life. Sometimes people only see what's written on paper, not what's written in the quiet moments." The man smiled, a little humbled by the words. The afternoon drifted on lazily. People shared stories, talked about fishing, ranching, weather, and simple things. Daniel's dog wandered around, happy to have so many hands offering him scraps of food. Someone even brought a small canoe, and a few of the kids took turns paddling near the dock. The laughter echoing off the water was pure and honest. At one point, the older HOA man sat beside Daniel on a bench. They both looked out at the water in silence for a while. Then the man said quietly, "I owe you an apology. For that day, for calling the police, for all the nonsense after. I didn't handle things right." Daniel looked at him, his face calm. That was a long time ago. No harm done. I still feel bad, the man said. We thought we were protecting the neighborhood, but we were just being prideful. It's easy to lose sight of what matters when you're busy following rules. Daniel gave a small smile. You did what you thought was right. We've all done that before. The important thing is that you came here today. Not with complaints, but with food and laughter. That means something. The man chuckled softly. You're a good man, Daniel. Daniel looked back at the lake. I just like peace. That's all I ever wanted. As the day turned to evening, the sky began to shift into soft pinks and oranges. Someone started a small bonfire near the shore, and the kids roasted marshmallows while the adults chatted. The warm glow of the fire reflected in the calm water. It was the kind of scene that made you forget the world beyond it. One of the women from the group pulled out a guitar and began to play softly, old country songs that everyone knew. People hummed along quietly. Even Daniel joined in for a verse or two. It wasn't planned or polished. It was just real. Later, when the last bit of sunlight faded and the stars began to peek through, everyone slowly packed up their things. There were handshakes, friendly hugs, and promises to do it again soon. The older man was the last to leave. Before he went, he turned back and said, We might have started off wrong, but I'm glad we ended up here. Daniel smiled. So am I. When the last car left and the night grew quiet again, Daniel sat by the dying embers of the fire. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, the same way it had the first night he'd moved there. He thought about how much had changed since then, not just around the lake, but inside him too. Owning the waterfront had never been about power or pride. It was about peace. But somewhere along the way, that peace had become something he could share, not just protect. As the night deepened, Daniel walked down to the dock. He untied his boat, climbed in, and drifted out onto the water. The air was cool, the stars bright. The boat moved slowly, making gentle ripples. Halfway across the lake, he stopped the motor and let the boat glide on its own. He looked up at the vast sky and felt a wave of calm wash over him. This quiet, was what it was all for. He thought about the people he'd met, the arguments, the laughter, the small moments that had led to peace. Life, he realized, wasn't about winning battles. It was about finding balance. The lake was perfectly still now. A small owl hooted from a tree nearby. Daniel smiled to himself, a deep, satisfied smile that came from the heart. He whispered softly, You did good, old man. The next morning, sunlight poured through the window and filled the room with gold. Daniel got up, stretched, and stepped outside with his coffee. The world looked new again, the way it always did after a good day. Across the lake, he could see a few neighbors walking their dogs, kids riding bikes along the path, and one of the men waving from his porch. Daniel waved back, then turned his eyes to the water. He noticed how the early light shimmered on the surface. Smooth, peaceful, endless. That's when he decided to put up a small wooden sign near the dock. Not a warning sign, not a private notice, just a simple message carved into the wood with care. It read, Peace starts where pride ends. He hammered it into the ground and stepped back to look at it. It wasn't fancy, but it was honest. Anyone who walked by would understand what it meant. The following weeks were filled with small, happy moments. Some of the kids came by occasionally to help feed the fish. A couple of families stopped to drop off baked goods. And sometimes Daniel would just sit on his porch, sipping coffee and watching the life around the lake grow a little warmer each day. He realized that when people stop seeing each other as problems to fix and start seeing each other as humans to understand, everything changes. The lake had taught him that. One late afternoon, as the sky glowed orange again, Daniel sat by the dock with his dog beside him. The breeze carried the scent of wildflowers. He looked across the water and saw the reflection of the trees swaying gently. He thought about the first time he parked his boat there, how something so simple had turned into such a long story. It had been frustrating, even funny at times, but now it all felt worth it. Every misunderstanding, every tense moment, had led to something better, to respect, friendship, and a peace that ran deeper than the water itself. The sun dipped lower, and the last bit of light shimmered across the surface of the lake. Daniel took a deep breath and smiled. Life had a strange way of working out, not always fast, not always easy, but somehow just right in the end. He leaned back. patted his dog's head and whispered, "We did it." "Buddy?" The dog wagged its tail softly. The sky turned darker. The first stars appeared, and the lake grew still once more, holding within it not just reflections of light but quiet proof that patience, kindness, and peace could outlast any storm. And there, on that calm night by the water, the story that began with a boat and an argument ended with something far greater: understanding.